early 90s. So they've been here for quite a long time. And so their families who have lived here, 20, 25 years uh, of being here. And one of the biggest problem that I see facing that population is stagnation. Families who have been working for all this years are not moving up in any way. They're working in a similar role for a decade or more, and not really ripping any benefits that can help move them up. And as a result, you see that um, the prospect for the generation that comes, the second generation, isn't as great, because a part of that improvement in quality of life for the next generation comes from whatever is built, from the previous generation. And I see that stagnation is making it really difficult for wealth to be built. And that's partly because of difficulty achieving upward mobility, people working in similar roles. So I think that's something that I see a lot, and they feel stuck because of because of the nature of the role which they find themselves in the factory setting, with very limited flexibility to pursue other development options. And so I see that as a really big problem. Thank you.
Let me quickly respond to that. And Arlo, you'll know why I'm thinking of you as I respond to this, but you don't have to take the bait. If I had a client and told me that I've been in my job for 30 years and haven't been promoted, have stagnated, have struggled to build wealth, I'd probably tell them to consider unionizing. And as a state and as a country, we're in the middle of probably the first in 30 or 40 years increase in union density. And I know the Southern Marine Workers Center does lots of work in this area. I know the nurses are unionizing in Portland, and if that happened, it would be one of the biggest private union efforts to succeed. A raft of nonprofits, including the one where I work, have unionized. At the same time, the union movement, just like the rest of the society, has been affected by racism and anti-Blackness and all kinds of other ethnic bias and bigotry. And so I'm curious, I'll ask the group, but Arlo, obviously I have you in mind, how you all deal with that. What's your relationship to the union movement? What is the best way to overcome the racism in that movement?
I wish I could whistle, because that's a, I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I'd write a book. I think like the short answer is that there isn't a short answer, right? Systemic oppression and the way it intersectionally affects and impacts most directly Black and poor workers, right, is always going to be an uphill battle for any sort of like power building, and unionizing is just one of the ways to build power, right? And so it is also one of the hardest times historically to unionize. Like if you look at labor laws and policy, and at the current conditions of COVID-19, like if you lose your job, the extremes of what could happen to you as an outcome are really high. And I think one of the things, at least, there's many ways that racism affects labor movement. And I also think it's important to name that as a worker center, we actually, like, the extent that what we can do is that we can't unionize legally, right? We can put workers in touch with unions. So we are not like formally part of labor. But worker centers occupy this really exciting like third space of being able to both troubleshoot and then organize, in smaller collective action campaigns on a workplace or on a policy level. So just to name that. But I think that when we talk about like racism, I do think organizing and, the act of solidarity and bringing workers together either around a policy issue or around a workplace organizing issue is a great way to like shift power analysis. But obviously organizing alone is not going to change the systemic oppression that people face. And so I think that like one of the obstacles for unionizing outside of the fact that the labor movement is very predominantly white, because a lot of the industries that Black folks or Black immigrant folks, specifically in Portland, historically occupy, like Heather McGee said, are in like areas of like domestic work, or like Latinx and other immigrant folks, Haitian immigrants, H-2A visa holders do agricultural work. So really hard areas to organize. And I would also say that I think due to the like conditions right now, I wish people also didn't have to face bottoming out or hitting rock bottom in order to organize. I wish that both through community care networks, mutual aid, eliminating, segregated community space, and also on a policy level, we could make it so that it's a more like energizing environment to unionize in, and not just from a place of like, Walmart workers needing to organize food in a break room in order to get it. So I don't know.
I really appreciate that response, Arlo. And it sounds like you do have enough material for a book. And Sonia, it looks like you're about to talk.
No, I was just like to build a little bit on that, saying, just quoting El Maggie. What's happened in Virginia? It was like the lower class of white folks and then the Black people getting together, organize themselves. Let's bring awareness to the upper class, to the, hey, if we let these people continue organized like this, we're gonna have a problem. So what we did back there, it's still a truth today, because we divide the class. That's why racism came in. So you are like, oh, you are, lower class, but white, you're different. You are some right, you don't have some right down there for the Black folks. The same thing is happening right now. So anytime that you want to try to organize, you have those folks like looks like myself. They don't feel like they have the right. To go in and unionize, because you're gonna hit them harder than other folks in the room, just because they can. What you have first, you don't even have a studies in the United States. Just begin for that. So if that hits you, it's gonna hit you harder than the natural citizens of the United States. So it's a very big, tricky situation when I see people in my community don't want to go there. I don't want to go, not even in a manifestation, just to claim the right. So it's a really tricky situation.
And Sonia, let me just ask you a question based on some of what you said. So responding to the original question that John was responding to, what do you think is the biggest economic challenge faced by the people in your community?
I think for us is the fact that what I'm saying is like we get denied to participate in the economy. By that I mean you get denied of the mean to go ahead, to improve. To get some part of the profit out of the economy. So that's the things that is hurting us the most. In order for us to, we are not bringing the best of ourselves to give. We are not giving it to the economy, and then that is it's kind of a systemic situation or policy situation that we're gonna perhaps talk about, or some other folks. And then I just salute James, by the way. The report was perfect. Just pick up all these points. The participation in the economy for the people like me, it's very important. We come with a lot of knowledge, a lot of stuff that we can give. But if we cannot, they don't give us the mean to go ahead and then do some go ahead in the economy, we cannot do anything. So that's it's a big issue, and then that's have some let's say racial root in that. So we're gonna dig on that sometime, perhaps with some questions.
Thank you for that answer, and Sonia, a lot to work on. I'll turn to Nicole Clegg. You lead probably the most powerful reproductive justice advocacy organization in the region. What would you say is the biggest obstacle to economic justice that people of color in the community you work with face?
Thanks, Michael. And just a small distinction, we would identify ourselves as a reproductive rights and health organization, and reproductive justice and that movement is owned and was developed by Black women and Asian American women who sort of founded that movement. So I certainly don't want us to be, while we are an ally, we couldn't, take credit for that work. I think there are a number of factors when we think about healthcare, like your health is determinative in terms of your ability to participate in the economy and establish, a quality of life for yourself and your family. And we are a safety net provider. So we provide care to all who need it, regardless of ability to pay. So we are acutely sensitive and aware of the struggles of how people don't anticipate and tend not to plan for the expense of a medical emergency. But one medical emergency can completely disrupt your life and send you on a course towards poverty. But before I sort of launch into sort of what I think we need to do, I do have to name that medicine and the delivery of healthcare in our country has been founded and has the advancements often come from racism and systemic racism. The advancements in medicine over the course of time were done often by exploiting the bodies and lives of BIPOC people. And, I say that in particular, when we think about reproductive health care, the person who's often identified as the father of gynecology, Marion Sims, exploited the bodies of enslaved Black women and experimented on them to develop and advance the delivery of gynecological care. And embraced a philosophy that people of color didn't feel pain the same way white people did, and used that as an excuse to deny them pain medication. So this might feel like distant history, but unfortunately it has informed medicine today. And so our systems have embedded systemic racism in how healthcare is delivered. This shows up in maternal and newborn health outcomes. We see this because Latinx people and Black people in particular have very different futures when it comes to pregnancy and the health of their newborns compared to white people. We see this with life expectancies, that white people have a better life expectancy in this country speaks to just the gross disparities that exist. And we saw this really recently in our state with the health outcomes related to COVID-19 and the fact that racial disparities showed up so dramatically and that we didn't have the systems in place to adequately respond to that. All of those things, if you're sick and you're embracing or trying to navigate through a system that's built on historic racism, you're not going to be able to step into the economy and accomplish or achieve a livable wage in the same way that a white person can. So I think that it's pervasive. It requires direct action, by us as healthcare providers and our policymakers to ensure that people can achieve the health without having to worry about, encountering systemic racism.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you for the extraordinary history lesson and for elucidating the history of reproductive justice versus reproductive rights versus reproductive health. That's all very, very important to hold on to. It's inspiring to hear, frankly. James, it looked like you were about to say something when Sonia earlier was speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to chime in a little bit. We were discussing, but I can talk more broadly as well. I think the discussion we were just having a little bit related to organizing and unionization speaks to sort of some of the broad themes that we were bringing up in the State of Working Maine report. One of which I think is just that the way that sort of laws and policies are structured in our country and our state are often designed to specifically exclude people of color and deny them sort of the full protection of the law. And so, the example that's been brought up of agricultural workers is a good one. There are a lot of basic employment rights that just don't apply to agricultural workers. And there are efforts this session in Maine to try and which would allow agricultural workers to unionize, which they currently can't do in Maine. They're not included under the National Labor Relations Act at the federal level, which really prevents their organizing ability. And also things like making sure that sort of state and federal minimum wages apply to agricultural workers and workers in other sectors as well. And, those exclusions are all good examples, I think, of what Heather was talking about, where we can see in the history that these exclusions weren't accidental. They were sort of deliberately put in to disadvantage sort of occupations that were more likely to be occupied by people of color, and agricultural workers and people who do sort of domestic work were high among those as well, but also kind of some of the wage and hour laws we have around restaurant workers and other people in the hospitality industry are sort of heavily influenced by those as well. So that was one thing that I was going to chime in with, and I think that also kind of speaks to the broader question that we're talking about, which is kind of like what are the bigger picture things that we see as challenges, and I think that's certainly one of them, the way the laws are structured. And then I think the other one is sort of the way that, where we do have a number of sort of protections of rights that aren't necessarily very well enforced, and that's true at a national level and at a state level. So the laws that we do have against sort of discrimination in the workplace or housing or healthcare, those are only as valuable as the enforcement mechanisms we have. And so that's the other strand that we sort of push on in State of Working Maine, is that, we really need to be funding the work of government to be able to protect workers and to crack down on racist activity by individuals. And again, I think it's probably no accident that, some of the same folks who are pushing for smaller government and reducing the size of these agencies, that also enables people to be more discriminatory as well.
So James, you touched on what sounds to me like a positive development, which is a migrant worker bill, a bill that would give stronger rights to migrant workers. And if it passed, my sense is it would increase racial justice in the economy in Maine. Let me put the question to the group. What other positive developments do you see where that would move Maine in the right direction in achieving racial equity and economic justice?
Well, yeah, I think the thing that we can do, Michael, is we have to review a lot of law in a lot of policy in Maine. Maine wasn't, 30 years ago or 35 for some, there wasn't this population. All of us weren't here. So now we are Maine, it's a little bit diverse. We have a lot of folks coming in and out. We have today the BIPOC people. We are here now. So we want to address this big question that I'm asking myself every day. Why are we poor? It's not mine. The question is not mine. But I'm asking myself this question. Why are we poor? Is it because we don't work hard enough? You are telling me the guy who works 3 jobs, okay, just to make a living, just to pay his rent, just to do what he worked 3 jobs, but still poor. Why are we poor? Is it because we are not working hard enough? Is it because we are lazy? Why is that we are poor? So when you are answering that question, you're gonna find those systemic barriers that stop us to move on, to shift what I was telling to the folks last time, to get access to the profit that we are producing, that we are generating in the economy of Maine. because the pandemic, the COVID just proved we produce, I mean, perhaps 25% of the economy. We are participating for that much. But can we get access to that too? In order for us to shift the position from whatever position we are to improve a little bit, perhaps to the middle class. Why are we poor? So let's go and answer this question, because I don't feel like we are lazy or we don't work hard enough. We say, work hard, you're gonna make it. We are working 3 jobs. Still, we are not making it. What's going on here? So that's the big question. And then when you look to that question, you look to the policy. What is that is stopping us to make it? The American dream, working hard. Can we make it? Why are we poor?
Nsiona, you mentioned a lot which could take us in many very, very interesting directions. For example, you mentioned how the racial disparity in COVID infections, which Nicole Clegg touched on earlier as well, wasn't just a terrible story of death and disease, but also a story that revealed what a big role people of color, especially Black people, play in Maine's economy. You also kept asking the question, why are we poor? And I know that James has worked on poverty rates in Maine and has compared Black poverty rates in Maine with Black poverty rates nationally. Do you happen to have statistics for those off the top of your head, James? I can vaguely recall it, but you might remember it better.
That's a good question. Normally I have so many statistics off the top of my head. I don't have those to hand. One thing I'll say is that I think, something that we had seen for a long time that Maine had some of the worst poverty rates for people of color, especially for Black Mainers. It was worse than almost any other state. I think those have improved in recent years. And part of that, I believe, is due to the impact of policies like the minimum wage law that has really helped to lift a lot of working folks out of poverty. So I think in some ways there's an example, even though it's still much higher than it should be, we're no longer as much of an outlier as we have been in the past there.
My memory, and I'm not going to quote numbers very precisely, I think national Black poverty is at something like the high 20% range, 25 to 30%, but Black poverty in Maine is something like 10 percentage points higher, if not more. And I found that extremely shocking when I first read it. And in other areas of Maine's various systems, racial inequities, including COVID-19 rates, end up being higher than much of the rest of the country. And so I'm curious what the group's response is to that. I mean, why is racial inequity in some cases worse in Maine than it is throughout the rest of the country? Please, Arlo.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things doesn't help is the talking point that Black people or people of color aren't here, even though we are on Wabanaki, Confederacy and Indigenous land. And the idea that, racism doesn't exist, and I think just personally as someone who's comes from 8 generations of, white colonial ancestry in Massachusetts on one side and Sierra Leone and first generation on the other, clearly there's a very long story of, Black participation and Black immigrant experience and all the other immigrant experience in Maine as there are in any other part. And I think that invisibility really also continues to incentivize ignoring or not prioritizing funding to those communities. Because if you make a group invisible, if you're working in jobs like overnight at a hospital cleaning, doing janitorial work, if you're working in direct care group homes where, people or nursing homes, people who are already overlooked by our society, if you're working 3 jobs, if you're working in a gig economy, if you're always working, you're never at the table. And so as long as we still keep saying Maine is the whitest state in America, we're gonna continue to be able to, not create the will or political pressure to say that it doesn't matter how many people are there. If there's 5 people and they have a problem, that needs to be addressed.
Please go ahead, John.
I'm gonna add to that. I think, from my own experience and not necessarily based on any overarching numbers, but I think that access to opportunity is determined in part due to determined by network and connections. I graduated college about 6 years ago, and getting out of there, I understood what it meant to have connection and network to different opportunities. And I think to some extent, the opportunities that exist in the economy, or the opportunity to develop skills, the opportunity to get support in certain areas for someone to get certain kind of relief to be able to move forward, maybe isn't reaching people of color at the same rate as these opportunities would be reaching white American counterpart, because of, because you might be able to say that those opportunities are closer in theory to people who have better connections to wealth and to power in some ways. And so that's part of what's driving that. And I think that, if you look at the, younger population that are growing, they're going to the same high schools, they're graduating, they're getting similar grades. They're not ending up in the same places. Why? Again, Siona's question, why are we poor? Some of that is because of that. We may be, even the kids that are starting out in the same place, they're not ending up in the same place, right? There has to be a reason, and I think part of that is connection and networks.
These are both very, very powerful answers. Nsiona, go ahead, please.
And then access to the opportunities. So opportunities are very, very important area. My own example, it's also I came here in America. I have a degree from my back home, but when I came here, nothing was translated to the American education. I didn't have connection. I didn't have opportunity that everybody has here. So I have to work and then pay tuition. I did everything. I have to get a GED again, and then do all the way back to the bachelor degree. So I had to work. My wife had to work. I work to pay my tuition. My wife had to work to pay the rent. So only one of us could go to school. Only one. Imagine if we have that opportunity. My wife could have a degree also today, both of us, but you don't have the opportunity where you don't have connection. It's the same also when it comes to job opportunity. You don't have the connection, you don't get that. How many of us who have skills but cannot translate it in America, or they don't have the connection that they need just to get to that next job? So that's the connection that I had that time with the people that's helped me to get my job. So in my job, it's a big chunk of money that's helped me today, perhaps to have a home, to stabilize my family in somehow, which nothing changed me. I'm the same person with the same degrees, but no, one thing changed: the connection. You have the network, you get what you want. You don't have the network, you don't. And then the network, as John said, there are some people who have that connection. They are more closer to the network than others. So we have to revisit all these things. The opportunity. Somebody said the difference between a brown or BIPOC person and a white person is not the color of the skin. The access, it's the access to the opportunity and power.
Nsiona, that's a profound point, and I think the Portland Press Herald just recently did an article about the economic costs of Maine's failure to translate licenses and credentials from other countries to Maine. It turns out every little profession has its own licensing procedure, and it's a patchwork system that works like a jigsaw puzzle of guilds, which are very, very, very difficult to change and move. They protect the interests of insiders and so on. And Arlo, you made a powerful point about invisibility, and John, you made a powerful point about networks, which Nsiona, you elaborated on. I'm going to direct your attention to the events of the last year, which drastically changed my relationship to the state of Maine and to the United States, and frankly to the world. Which what happened over the last year is two big things: the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so what the Black Lives Matter movement meant for my personal life was, I thought I knew lots of Black people in Maine. I maybe quadrupled my network of Black and Brown and Indigenous people in Maine. There was this progressive coming together of people across racial lines. I met lots of white progressives as well. I met lots of Black, Brown, Indigenous, other people of color, radicals and progressives. And finally, actually for the first time in my more than 5 years living in Maine, felt some feeling of belonging to this state. And I'm curious about your reflections about the relationship between that movement, its central slogan, defund police, other parts of that movement, your own experience, and economic justice in Maine.
I think I'll just say that I had a similar experience of, from the time that the movement, erupted with the hashtag because of Patrice Concolors, Alicia Garza, and I'm spacing on the other person's name, and the movements in Ferguson around the death of Mike Brown, and then yet again the movements that came out of the murder of George Floyd, and also the systemic inequity that was exposed by the pandemic. I too felt the energy from the Black Lives Matter movement that also I saw feed into supporting for anti-poverty work and supporting houseless people's rights in Portland, and expanding into a slate of progressive agendas that were passed in the Portland municipality. And I think it all built off of each other because people are able to see each other and better connect these intersectional struggles for oppression in a way that are really critical. And I think one of the most powerful parts of the Black Lives Matter movement is the reminder that we've always been here and that we're tired of yelling about the same things that we have been since slavery. Like slavery wasn't just a static system of, people being in chains. It was a movement of series of uprisings constantly until it's ending, right? And so like people have always been, as long as there's been oppression, people have been rising up against it. And I think that people are just calling attention to that and saying the time's up to act, and that there's more than enough, lists and listicles and agendas and policy resources to pick from, and now we just need to do something.
It's really cynical, if I can, May and Michael. Also, it's like they were telling us stay home, stay 6 feet apart, but you still more connect. I mean, even more staying home. I mean, avoiding a group of people, a relation of people, but we feel connected. And then the thing that to put this together with the economy is like I was like, my God, these things, this situation right now, you see now people paying attention and then pouring money in issues that concern my people. I'm like, well, why we didn't do that for this year? we needed generation and generation, because let's say I'm the first generation immigrant, but my kids is the second generation. We are going through situation in America that my kid, it's gonna be different for my kid. What I want is people to invest to my kid education so that he doesn't be like me. Like he end up doing just minimum wage job. I wanted to invest in his education. I want this kid to get a level that when he get to the market, he can go to the CEO position, not just to be in my position, just a surviving situation. So that's wake me up. There is resource out there. Why we are not using it? Why we are not utilizing this money? Why you were not, let's say that like this, utilizing this money to help us before? So now people, and then the other things in the economy is like we are all this together. That was a very big call of COVID-19 situation and Black Lives Matter. So we are all in this together. Look at the number of COVID. I mean, I work with a community in Brunswick. Nobody have work permit, no case. Zero, no COVID case, no work permit, no case. But the community that I have in Portland, in Lewiston, Auburn, York, who are active, economically active, we come up with together, we are like 25% of cases. And when I'm telling you that, the other Caucasian percentage that we give you, perhaps half of that percentage of that population are not active anymore in the economy. So if we take the inactive people who retire who are in the nursing home already, we take them away from the equation, we active people in the economy, we could be 50% of the economy. Right now, active participant in the economy, 50%. But are we getting the same percentage of profit out of the economy? So this is, I mean, it ring the bell. We are together. We need to support each other. We need to make it fair for everybody, for all of us. And then I know people who have power. They can make it happen. They can make it happen just as they did in COVID. I'd never seen that amount of money being poured. I mean, in the community, never. But when COVID came, the money came so we can figure it. So that was a very big, lesson for me. So I'm like, it's just people will. If we want it, we can change it.
Yeah, Michael, let me add something real quick to that. So, the Black Lives Matter movement really, I think, to me, it was a really refreshing thing to see that power of numbers and power of collective messaging and the resilience to just refuse to back down, because I think at the beginning, what a lot of different non-supportive groups wanted was for that movement to just fade away at some point and just they could go back to their normal lives and do whatever was comfortable for them. And it was just great to see that did not happen. And I saw, I saw institutions that could no longer hide behind their bad policies that were keeping away the voices that were calling for fairness in the ways that business was done, whether that's at municipal level or very local level, likewise for different organizations. But we also saw partner organizations that stepped up to really amplify those messages led by people of color, to say there has to be a change and we're not avoiding that conversation. So that was really important, because if you look at where people are now, that there's a lot of self-examination efforts that came out of that. And we see that in a lot of different places where organizations now realize they can't just say that organizations with power to impact the lives of, especially BIPOC people, can no longer be silent. They had to come out and say, this is what our position is. And that's really driven a lot of self-examination effort, so that they understand, because a lot of the things that end up affecting the outcomes and affecting the trajectory of growth for BIPOC people, some of that is housed within organizations that have power, whether that's in municipal or state level or some national agencies. They have to examine themselves and really be able to come out and say that we are, in fact, not, we're actually changing policies that impact BIPOC people negatively. So I hope that will continue, and that we're slowly going to get at the bottom of those small things that make a big negative impact on the lives of BIPOC people.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Nsiona, for your enlightening comments. There are 10 minutes left in this panel, and I want to remind audience members that they are free to ask questions if they have any. But I want to hone in on something Nsiona said around how this crisis created an enormous level of investment in communities, and how government intervention of that sort is often spurred by crisis. It's unfortunate for change to depend on crisis, but in all of our work, in all the work that everyone on this panel does, there are certain changes that would make our work more successful. So I'll ask a member of the group that hasn't had as much of a chance to speak, Nicole, if you had to pick one important change that has to happen for your work to be more successful, what would it be?
Well, that's tough to limit it just to one. So I'll cheat a little bit and speak to two. I think I'll speak directly to healthcare first, which is we need universal healthcare. People should not be having to make life and death decisions about whether or not they slip further into poverty, or they can take care of themselves or their families. It's just totally unacceptable that today in our country, that's the choices that people are having to make. And then sort of secondly, because I'm going to cheat a little bit, there is a real issue here of representation in our state, and especially when we think about elected leaders. The simple fact of the matter that our state legislature, which makes extraordinarily important decisions about our lives, has two people of color serving is unacceptable. And we should be looking at how our legislature is constructed to make sure that it is better representative of the people, and people are supported and encouraged to run for office. It can't just be, we won't make the progress that we need to make if we don't have a more diverse group of people involved in setting policy.
So, thank you, Nicole. I think two is fine, and we can roll those two into one and just call it socialism. or call it what Heather McGee calls it, which is the solidarity dividend. James, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Nicole that it's difficult to just pick one. I think, I mean, something that I think a lot about is, you know, getting as much as possible, getting rid of a lot of these exemptions and loopholes we have in different versions of labor law, so that, you know, no matter where somebody works, they have the same basic protections under the law, and you know, that we don't decide that one class of workers is less valuable than another. And so I think that could make a huge difference if we did that, or just because, you know, somebody is employed by a smaller business means they have fewer rights than others. I think that is a big, you know, part of it as well. So I think the way that a lot of our policies are constructed right now, there are so many gaps and holes in the protections that we give to workers. It makes it really hard for a lot of folks, especially people of color, to get ahead. So if I had to pick one, that might be the one that I would choose.
Great, thank you, James. Arlo, would you be willing to pick one thing that would make your work more successful? One change, one policy.
Yeah, I still don't know if I have an answer to that question. I mean, I think, you know, the Southern Maine Worker Center advocates for, you know, policies for human rights, and healthcare as a human right and working with dignity are two of our central tenets. And so the ability to have access to healthcare and work with dignity are, you know, just should be human rights. And I would say that, like, there, so much has been enumerated by the pandemic that it's very hard to say, but I think it's mostly like, I think I'm personally see a lot of performative policy passed with no enforcement, and the idea of passing a law, if it's supposed to fundamentally make a change, it needs to be able to be used. And so I think there can't be so much of a spread between passing something as important as paid sick time without any ability for a worker to use it, and putting all the impetus on folks who are in the most marginalized industries and positions to know, like, the magic word, so that they can know what would, you know, so that they're able to count and be protected by things like the Whistleblower Protection Acts. So I just think making it easier for workers to use the laws that they are passed, and so that they actually get to make meaningful changes in people's lives, would be one of the highlights I think I've learned.
Thank you, Arlo. And I'll ask the same question of John.
I also I'm having a really hard time deciding on an answer. But I would say that, you know, I would want to speak about funding. I think that, you know, what Nsiona mentioned earlier about the funding that came in toward the organizations that were previously disregarded, but whose work was, you know, at least for that time period, recognized to have value that impact and improve the quality of life for the community. I think that's something that if that would continue, because I think the way that funding decisions have been made, especially at the state level, it doesn't regard the efforts of BIPOC led organizations at the same level as, you know, the efforts of more established institutions. Even though if you look at the, you know, the work itself, what they're addressing might be similar in nature, but because of their institutional history and or connection to the people in power that make funding decisions, that somehow they're seen as much less riskier in terms of allocating funding to them. And also, I think the other element is that they don't have to defend those decisions, because it doesn't, it seems like it it doesn't get the sort of pushback from groups that don't know or don't want funding to go to organizations led by BIPOC. So I think that has a long-term, you know, potential. Like if these organizations are chronically underfunded, then they're not going to have the impact that they could have, and therefore the outcome is poor results. So that's one thing that I would really want to keep.
And we have 3 minutes. I recognize that this is an unfair question. And I'm even reminded of a quote from one of my favorite authors, Audre Lorde: "We don't live single issue lives, so we can't have single issue struggles." And so, Nsiona, if you answer the question, if we have enough time, I'll answer it as well. But if there was one change that could happen to make your work more successful, what would it be?
Yeah, because I want you to answer it, so I'm gonna make my answer short. So it will be a policy around access to the mean of production. So we have to give access to the mean of production to the BIPOC. We need it. That's a way we're gonna change a lot of stuff. Just doing that. I saw restaurants born and closed in my community. Why? Because people don't have money to go spend in a restaurant and get closed. Why? Because we don't have access to the profits that we generate. So if we could have that, people have access to the mean of production, we could have that profits shared equally. We could invest in other business, and then we can support other business. So policy that give access to the mean of production or the BIPOC, facilitate that process. It's gonna make it, Maine's gonna be the next Las Vegas. Yes, thank you.
All right, Nsiona, we have less than a minute, so I'll keep my answer brief. 2 words: fair taxation. That's the one thing I want. So it's 2:14, and I believe this panel is concluded. I am very grateful for all your time and your company, and hope that I can see you in person sometime in the next decade. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all very much. This has been a great panel, and for folks who have attended, again, I've tried to record the bulk of this. We might have missed some initial early comments, but again, you've got folks' names from the discussion from our website if you want to follow up with specific questions or learn more about the work that panelists are involved in the state and elsewhere. I'd certainly encourage you to do that. We will be back next Wednesday, same time, same channel, although it's a different Zoom login. But again, want to acknowledge that, you know, as we talk about these kinds of issues, certainly we've tried to represent diverse voices and communities. We didn't get them all, and that's a perpetual challenge and need for ourselves to hold ourselves up against. But I think this gives you a flavor, at least, of some of the concerns that we have in Maine and how we can all be better together. Again, next Wednesday, same time, please encourage people to join if you value this, and you'll get more information on some of the challenges we have specific to the state budget and the revenue challenges ahead and how we can address those. And as always, thank you again to our sponsors for their support and making it possible to have such a great group of speakers today and next week as well. So be well. I hope everybody gets out and enjoys some of this sunlight before it disappears on us. And thank you all again.